everybody. Welcome. We are here for our very first Incidentally in the News this week. Video blog, podcast, whatever you want to call it. We're here. I'm here with Larry Whiteside, our CTO, Kadir Levent, our COO, and Felix Weiss, our head of CERT in Canada and US.
Now Global IR.
Global
IR, yeah.
I don't even have all my upgraded promotions in place here. So that is who we've got on the call, folks. I'm Erin Keating. I'm here as your host. I also serve as the head of marketing for CyberClan, and we are excited to bring you weekly topics that are just in the news, and we just want to chat about, give you some of our intelligence on it and our thoughts on it based on our expertise in the cybersecurity industry. So two big topics to cover off today. The breach, everyone's talking about it, but let's talk about it a little bit more from our expertise, especially in incident response, and the UK decision, the European High Court's decision to allow their data privacy rules to overrule what we may see in the US as necessary for national defense and intelligence. So let's kick off with the Twitter breach. Felix, Twitter was hacked. And it is not just a case of different accounts being seen as compromised. It's a much bigger thing that people may not even be thinking about right now. But maybe if you could just tell us, like, what is Twitter? What's happening right now? You are head of incident response, emergency response. What's happening right now over there? And what have you heard about the incident?
So I think at this stage, there's still a lot of speculation as it's very fresh about what exactly happened. What we know has happened that several or a good amount of high-profile individuals had their Twitter account hijacked into posting some kind of a scam message. Now, the first thing that always comes to mind is, are we talking about an isolated incident, i.e. have these individuals each been compromised by a group or by a hacker, and was that then used to post these messages, or are we looking at something a lot bigger, a lot more dangerous, and has Twitter itself been compromised? Now, I believe at this stage, the investigation is still ongoing. It's been only a day or so since the incident happened, and I expect it will be going for a little while longer. But if it is indeed Twitter itself that has been compromised, then there have been some serious failures on their internal controls of how that could happen, and that will really potentially change the way we look at big tech in terms of what we can expect and how they will guide us through these kind of times. I mean, Twitter is one isolated piece, but don't forget about the other ones, such as Microsoft or the other social media networks such as Facebook. Like, what kind of impact can it have if they don't have their own internal controls in order and are susceptible to breaches like these?
Yeah, and it looks like it was typical social engineering of staff that was inside of Twitter. So, I mean, Larry, you're a former CISO. You're responsible for building our technology stack right now, and all of internal and external that we're using. What do you have to say about what the CISO of Twitter is doing right now, and how important a human firewall is?
Yeah, so they're scrambling, right? So the CISO is really being, I guarantee, held accountable right now from a board perspective and from a leadership perspective to get to the root cause of this. But simultaneously, right, they're trying to not just figure out that root cause, but really deal with how do they ensure that nothing else is going on, right? It's going to be a tough week for them because, fixing those accounts was one thing, getting to the root cause is another, but then doing, sort of a compromise assessment to try and figure out where there may be somebody else in, right? This goes to an industry-based problem that everybody has related to detection of when something bad is happening. I think the statistic right now is 267 days is the amount of time that attackers are, typically inside of an organization before it's identified that they're there. And so when you look at this type of situation, because I think when I first heard the news, the first thing I thought was, well, did they have multi-factor in place? Was this a multi-targeted attack that they just compromised multiple individuals simultaneously, right? But then as I heard more about who all of the individuals were, I was like, yeah, it's very highly unlikely that somebody like President Obama, who's got, advisors to his right and his left, didn't have some basic security controls in, like multi-factor. And so as more came out on the attack, my ears started perking up, and I was like, oh boy, right? Like this goes to, we like to call it insider threat, but it's not necessarily insider threat. It's really insiders being utilized as threat vectors, right? And so this starts to take us down the path of ensuring that we've got proper controls, proper architecture and segmentation of all of the different people who are inside of our company, so that, you know, this type of threat vector, right, through the human can't be taken advantage of and be used in this way.
Yeah. Kadir, you're a former law enforcement individual. You also head up all of our IR and response teams up until now. And this had a multi-layered effect. Again, it did in fact take cryptocurrency from people. I think they've estimated about $140,000 total that's transferred around. I mean, how do you think the investigators are looking at this right now? And is there any chance, I don't think, that any of those people can get their money back even? And we don't even know where the money went. It wasn't going to the individuals that were perpetrated.
Well, this is the interesting thing, really. So there's a couple of things that I'm going to pick up that Larry mentioned as well. So if we kind of roll this back to just the bones of what it is, so this is absolutely social engineering, and that's what they've done here, right? They socially engineered the people that were seeing those posts, and it's really interesting to see how naive people can be as well, right? To read something like that, and everybody, you know, it's a quick win. It must be legit. This is who they say they are. And this is where I can throw a statistic in and say in 2019, if we look at that year in isolation, phishing itself accounted for 90% of recorded data breaches. And when you look at, again, it's just people trusting what they receive, trusting what they see, taking it on face value. But really, you know, one of the things that we used to say in law enforcement when we spoke to victims is, look, if it sounds too good to be true, it's probably too good to be true, right? So regardless who that is that's presenting it to you. So I think that's the first thing I think that's interesting around the whole social engineering side of things. Now, from a law enforcement perspective, I am 100% certain that law enforcement are now all over this, and they're going to be working very closely with various social media platforms. There's going to be lots of cross-border, cross-correlation work that's going to be done now. And in terms of cryptocurrency itself, there's actually been a lot of developments in cryptocurrency in terms of how the analysis is being made, because for those who don't know, cryptocurrency works on various algorithms, but it works on a chain of events, effectively, which is known as the blockchain. And every single transaction is recorded. And even though it's anonymous to an extent, those transactions can still be affiliated further down the line. So you can track generally where the payments are eventually ending up. And some analysis was done by Chain Analysis. And I follow those guys pretty closely. And Felix can probably speak to this a bit more. But I can't remember the exact percentage, but they can actually trace where those funds end up in terms of an exchange. And at the point where them funds are then being taken out, that's where law enforcement are getting involved. So there's definitely some pretty clever stuff that happens in terms of the investigation work. And I'm sure there's a lot that the FBI, probably Homeland Security, the CIA, the MI6, NCA, whatever you want to call it. I'm sure those guys are very heavily involved.
They're all on the case. Yeah, we've got them all.
Yep.
Yeah, and in terms of returning the money itself, there have been instances in the past also about cryptocurrency fraud, such as ransomware payments, where the analysis done by Chain Analysis actually ended up allowing them to work with law enforcement to freeze an account on an exchange, which effectively stopped the threat actor from getting paid out. It didn't quite return the Bitcoin to anyone, but it did stop them from making money off it.
Right. Gotcha. Okay. Well, we're supposed to be doing a quick round trip here on these things so we can get the information out. Any last comments on the Twitter breach?
Don't believe what you see.
Yeah. So you know, it was asking me last night on the news segment whether or not, as consumers, we should stop trusting big tech companies and stop trusting them, you know, just holistically based on this, because, you know, Facebook and misinformation, now Twitter and this breach and account takeovers. And I said, no, you shouldn't really stop trusting them. However, people have got to start just doing their own basic due diligence, right? If I get a tweet from President Obama, right, the likelihood, right, that where there's some sort of money exchange that's going to happen, I mean, just common sense tells me the likelihood of that is, you know, 0 to none. Right. And so if I were to get something like that, rather than saying, oh, wow, look at how amazing God is, look, my prayers have been answered, I'm going to look at that with an eye of skepticism. And I think that's what we've got to get to a reality of, is looking at everything through a lens of questioning, and not thinking that everything that you get just because it came from a verified account, that it's the actual reality.
Good to know. Okay, well, we talked a lot about having to exchange all of this information with law enforcement, cross borders, everything. That leads us to our second topic. The European Union's top court just invalidated an agreement between the US and the UK on data sharing, especially when it comes to breaches. Larry, maybe if you can take us through a little bit more of like, what's the history on this thing and where we stand today based on this new ruling?
Yeah, so this is interesting, and it's actually very impactful. So there was a thing called the Privacy Shield Agreement that had been in place, and its purpose was to enable U.S.-based companies to extract log data and different types of data as it relates to breaches from their European data centers and places where they store data. Now, the value in that was so that it could be provided to law enforcement and so forth to do investigations and to do deep analysis and things. And so the impact of not being able to grab that data and pull it across because of potential privacy violations of the individuals in the EU now forces you to sort of handle these investigations in two different buckets, and potentially could cause an organization to have to go through some sort of legal channels just to get that data extracted out of the EU, or force it to go through a European-based law entity where you hand it to them, and then through their coordination with U.S. forces, law enforcement, that they then do that collaboration, which is a far more time-consuming effort, is a far more costly effort, and really just helps the attackers.
Yeah, well, I mean, Felix and Kadira, please weigh in, but we are a global company. We handle incidents across the world. Kadira, you're based in the UK. Felix, I believe you're in Canada, yeah? Mm-hmm. And Larry, you're here in the US. I'm here in the US. So I'm not only thinking about the companies that are actually being breached, I'm thinking about us as the response team that's working on this, the forensics team, the restoration team. We run the gamut in all of these services and helping companies. What are the challenges for us, and what are you guys thinking about?
So I think for incident responders in general, you're always playing a cat and mouse game with the attacker. You come up with a solution, the attackers find out, they try to bypass it, and the game starts all over again. For that to work, for us to stand a chance, it's very important that we can share data in real time. Any new attacks, any new information that we learn from each other, share with each other, and any measure that's put in place to complicate that will make it a lot harder for the defenders to match up with the attackers, who don't have to hold themselves to any laws or regulations and can bypass those kind of restrictions for real-time interaction and information share.
Yeah, wouldn't that be hilarious if the entire attacker community said, "Oh no, the privacy, we can no longer extract data across from the UK to the US. Man, this is really going to impact our ability to breach companies." Yeah, no.
Yeah,
that's not happening.
Yeah, I mean, what would you say about that? Because I mean, this also goes to how we counsel people on business continuity, and it extends that period of time. What are you thinking?
Well, I was going to say exactly that. So it's important to say that the Privacy Shield system was put into place between the EU and the US as well, right? So it's more of a European agreement. So with the future Brexit that's going to be happening across the UK, that in itself was going to cause challenges anyway. So there was always going to have to be new agreements between the US and the UK specifically, because we will no longer be part of the Euro. Also, the UK needs to build its own agreements with the rest of Europe. So there was always going to be data transfer issues between the UK and the rest of the world. So I think this is definitely the fact that this has happened with Europe. I think this is definitely going to expedite any agreements, any future agreements that happen from the UK to the rest of Europe and the US. I think there's always going to be exceptions, right? I think that's the thing here. And I think like Felix said, like Larry said, criminals are going to exchange data. They're not going to stop exchanging that data. And I think it's finding that balance of, well, what can be exchanged freely that's not going to put people at risk. So a lot of what we do when we do cross-border data transfers, we are not transferring personal information. So when we look at what the privacy around that looks like, we're not putting anybody at risk. what we're taking across are artifacts or elements of data that do not contain any personal information, but aids and assists with an effective investigation. So I think from our point of view, definitely we need to take all of these things into consideration, and we'll be building plans around that. But ultimately, we're also, again, like Aaron, like you mentioned, we're cross-border, right? So we're already thinking about what kind of information is shared amongst us internally so that we protect our clients and data sovereignty, etc. So definitely on our radar.
Yeah, I mean, it's tough because I get the data privacy and that individuals are worried about this. Apparently, this came from, I think it was an Australian who's a big advocate for privacy. But to the extent that this now costs businesses, and businesses need to think about this, the longer it takes to investigate and remediate your breach, the more expensive it is for your customers, for yourself, for the team that's working on it. Those things need to be taken into consideration too. So we want the government to be careful, but we want to make sure it doesn't become a hindrance to us avoiding these types of things in the future. All right, well, those were our 2 topics of the day. Any final thoughts on that before we wrap up and bring some more news to everyone next week?
I think it might be good for organizations to realize while this agreement has now been rescinded, the actual enforcement of whatever is in place now is always a question as well. What they intend to do versus what they actually end up doing isn't always the same. So
That's true.
To tell what the real impact of this will be.
So that's a very valid point, because the court making a ruling doesn't automatically just put a big X on the document in the agreement. So that there is still going to have to be that act of back and forth and figuring out what this ultimately means and what the go forward path is. So.
Awesome. Well, I love this, guys. I hope that we can continue to do this week to week. It certainly helps educate me. These are just articles I read, and then I need your expertise to delineate the information for me. I hope our viewers and listeners find it interesting too, and I look forward to bringing you guys back here next week on Incidentally in the News. Thanks, Larry, Felix, and Kadir.
Thanks,
Aaron.